Let me introduce our speaker tonight. This is Julie Oatfield, who's a longtime barker, whose love of bugs as a kid has only deepened. And so thank you, Julie, and take it away.
Well, thanks for the sweet introduction, Daniela. Yeah, hello everyone. Thank you really so much for being here. This is the first time I've done like an official presentation for BARC, and I'm super excited. So for those of you, a lot of you are familiar to BARC, a lot of you aren't. I'm surprised I had so many of my amazing friends who barely know what I do show up, and that's just like, yay, so encouraging. But anyways, yeah, this is organized through BARC, which is a really cool forest advocacy group that's based in Portland, Oregon, helping protect Mount Hood National Forest. And here I can give a little bit, I can show kind of BARC's general mission statement. Don't feel the need to read through all of it, because in essence, what we do is make sure that we prioritize Mount Hood National Forest as a place where natural processes prevail, wildlife thrives, and local communities have really holistic investment in its restoration and preservation. So making sure that the forest stays awesome and forested for its own sake, as well as for people to go out and enjoy, rather than kind of continuing this model of extraction that's really been predominating the landscape for the past 100-200 years. So since 1999, BARC's been organizing people to keep the forest awesome. A lot of that happens through boots on the ground work, monitoring things like proposed timber sales. But a lot of it is also kind of on this more fun side, kind of monthly sessions that are guided hikes, ecology clubs. In pandemic times, that's meant virtual hikes, which have been really interesting and really cool as a way to kind of stay connected, keep conversations going, and keep learning together, which is really cool. Great, and so as this very place-based organization, BARC has been having an evolving acknowledgement practice, realizing that the land we're on has a lot of history and a lot more to its present than usually gets acknowledged. So I'll take at least several minutes to go over a brief acknowledgement practice. As an organization founded by white people in the settler colonial lineage, BARC is part of the legacy of land theft and the erasure of Native authority over the lands now referred to as the public lands of Mount Hood National Forest. As an organization, we have established influential relationships with the Forest Service, part of the same federal government which facilitated violent land theft, colonization, and displacement of Indigenous people. Non-Native Barkers who have access and privilege to this land because of this violent legacy. We are working to transform our organization to take responsibility for this legacy and these unearned privileges. We are learning to practice acknowledgement, respect, and support for the Malalas, Kalapuyans, Chiniki, Clackamas, Chiniki, Wascos, Northern Paiute peoples, and Sahaptin-speaking peoples who live here and who have always lived here, and the many other Native nations who have always been part of and cared for this land that we now occupy. So in addition to this part of just acknowledging, we want to make sure this is a bit more of a practice as well. So hold on one moment. Yeah, thanks for reading through this practice with me. And if there happen to be Indigenous people who are attending today who have anything to say about this particular acknowledgement or just want to say something, I'll leave like several moments of open space for people to pipe up and unmute themselves or drop something in the chat. So pause for a moment. Okay, and further, for all the non-Indigenous people who have shown up tonight, feel free to take a moment to reflect on your intentions for this evening, whether you're joining us similarly from a place in Portland or Oregon or wherever you are on land. Feel free to take a moment to consider this history, this present, and this future of the land you're on. Spending a few more minutes on this, if there is someone who would like to share some of their reflections or some of their intentions for tonight, either verbally or in the chat, I'll leave about 10 seconds more pause of that for people to put something out there if they like. Okay, and before we move on, I would encourage people to join me in one more moment of silence, this time to express humble gratitude and apology to the original people here tonight across these lands in the past, present, and future. And then we shall start the workshop. Great, thank you everyone for participating in that and hopefully getting some good thoughts flowing in your head. Great, so I can move on. Danielle introduced me and I was grateful. Better than I can introduce myself. I'm hardly sure what to say about myself, but my name is Julie. I've worked at BARC for about 3 years. And as Danielle also mentioned, arachnids and bugs have just been something I've really loved for many years. I did have like some training studying them when I was in undergrad. So some of this information comes from there, other comes from just years and years of observation. I think that's the best way to learn, is to kind of just like ask for stories from people around you, gather information. I know that's something I've had a lot of access to at Bark, is when you go hiking with people, you just learn goodness knows how many awesome things about all the cool things around you. So yeah, we can move forward to, yeah, talking more about arachnids tonight. So a lot of what I'll be talking about is specific to kind of like the Pacific Northwest region. Not super specific. In my research, I didn't find a whole lot of info about species that only ever live at Mount Hood National Forest. So if you're in, you know, the west coast of the US, or even across the US, a lot of these species should be familiar and relevant to you. And I'll also be spending some more time at the end to kind of also just explore what other cool arachnids exist out in the world that we might not get to see in person at Mount Hood anytime super soon. But yeah, hoping to give you like a little taste of all the cool stuff that's out there. And I do really like being interrupted with questions. I like it when things are somewhat of a two-way street. I know that's really tricky in the virtual era, but do feel free to use that chat box. You can unmute yourself as well. It seems like there's a fair number of people here, so that it shouldn't be too chaotic and out of control if there's, you know, one or two people wanting to speak at once. So great. Yeah, let's move on to check out some arachnids. All right, here's like a really brief overview of kind of how we're gonna start exploring all these cool arachnids. One is kind of, who are they? So what group of animals are we talking about? Is it just spiders? There's actually a lot more to it, which is pretty cool. Things like, you know, types of habitat, life cycle, behavior. We'll give a really quick introduction to who we're looking at. And then we'll move on to kind of the more specific, zooming in, spotlights on the various arachnids, kind of just bouncing around between a lot of what you'll see maybe out on a hike, or if you're like really invested in kind of wanting to turn over a few logs and stones and really do some exploring, checking out all the ones you could see, or in your own backyard, or local, if you have access to a community garden or a park, those are also great places to look for some of the ones we'll be talking about tonight. Then we'll take a step back more towards the end, taking the bigger picture, being like, why should we care about these things? Why are, you know, we've learned a lot of interesting things. Why is this relevant? What else can we do with that? I know sometimes a lot of people start with those kinds of presentations being like, oh, why should we care? But you're already here. So it seems like you're already somewhat interested, and I'm so grateful that you are. And we'll have time at the end for lots of questions, and I do hope you have lots of questions. I partially wrote that for myself because I know I still have lots of questions about all the stuff I still want to learn about arachnids, so I can share some of those questions with you, as well as hopefully try and address some of the questions that you have. Great, all right. So for a little bit of context, like I said, kind of like, who are we studying? A lot of you are probably familiar with the concept of a tree of life. This is like a somewhat universal concept of kind of seeing like, oh yeah, animals are related to each other, like socially, genetically, all these different levels to it. And so a lot of the, you know, arachnids are one of the designated groups that more like taxonomical phylogenetic science kind of organizes them into, based on things like genetics and morphology, which is like the shape and structure of animals. And that's kind of one way to look at them. I'm using it as a way to organize today because it's kind of like the web of life is so messy and amazing, so it kind of helps to zoom in on one little piece at a time. But it does have its limitations, of course, like just zooming in on what you perceive to be one solid little group. The structure of what's an arachnid is really, really in flux. Like one exciting thing, for example, is they're wondering if like horseshoe crabs are technically arachnids because they have very similar structures with like chelicera, which are appendages that aren't legs but are really close to the face. Or as we like find, as we study more and more species, we have to constantly rearrange how the tree of life is organized. So again, it's a flawed way to look at it, but we'll move forward and try and make some sense of it as we go. So, okay. Whoops. Sorry, I didn't have everything I wanted to say before. The next slide is a little bit text heavy, so I'll try and walk you through really slow. Don't be too intimidated. Anyways, one more thing about this tree of life is that, so if you can kind of see here, hopefully you can see my cursor swing around, that's right in the middle basically is where the arachnids are here. So spiders and scorpions are two of the biggest examples given there in the middle. And they branch pretty closely over to crustaceans and insects. So that's kind of, if that's situating you where in the web of life we are. And really far back, like hundreds and hundreds of millions of years, is kind of where the ancestors of what would become vertebrates like humans comes in. So this gets really into ancient history. We're not super closely related, but you know, we share a good chunk of the same DNA and everything. And so today there's over a dozen different extant types of arachnids. We'll get more into like what those types mean. And there's over 100,000 species that have been assigned a binomial name. So really, really, really massive group of animals. So I'm excited to talk at least about a handful of them today, but there's so much more to explore and to learn about as we go. So in this next slide, I'll kind of zoom in a little bit to kind of situate like what do we mean when we talk about arachnids as a taxonomic group and compare that to humans. And since it's blackberry season, I was like, oh, let's compare it to a plant. Let's pick a native form of blackberry. So yeah, more specifically, maybe from like 9th grade science class or something, you can recall that there were all these, there's this really long acronym of how to remember the, the tree of life, this taxonomic system that we use. So maybe a lot of it's familiar, like kingdom, is animals versus plants versus all the like fungi and some other groups. And then the order from there goes kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. So when we talk about arachnids, we're talking about a class of animals. I know that doesn't mean much, but when we think about it, like, oh, mammals are also a class, that can help kind of give a context of what a great variety we're encompassing when we talk about arachnids. And I know bark tends to attract a lot of plant nerds, so I wanted to throw a little bit of some comparison to how, like, say, a species of plant lines up with these groupings. And again, to reiterate just how like messy and fluid a lot of these categories are, plants don't always have like really easily distinguishable like phylums and classes. They're kind of in these general groups that are like sub-kingdoms and things like that. So angiosperms refers to like flowering plants, for example, and then eudicots is showing the like, oh, the ones that start growing with 2 leaves, et cetera, et cetera. So you can definitely get lost in the weeds with all this like over-categorization of life, but sometimes it can kind of help you to like have a couple parameters to start exploring one group at a time. So that's what we're going to do with the arachnids today. And the one I chose for this particular graph right here is one of my absolute favorites, and I hope it's going to be one of your favorites too, is the jumping spider. This is maybe one that you all are familiar with. They are really, really frequent in people's gardens and homes, as well as out at Mount Hood National Forest. I've dedicated a couple slides to them because they're like the really charismatic microfauna of the invertebrate world, as some people compare them. So yeah, let's see what else we got. Oh, actually, now would be a good time if just to kind of like get a gauge of like people thinking about like, oh, what are arachnids even? I think there's a poll that Danielle helped me set up, so it's a somewhat interactive thing. If you're calling in on a phone, I'm sorry, it won't work very well, but if you have a screen in front of you, hopefully a poll will show up in just a moment.
Fingers crossed.
Yes. So it's a multiple choice. Which ones of these do you think are arachnids? I am not grading this or judging this. I'm just kind of curious to get people's brains flowing. Ooh, I see answers flowing in, nice. All right, I'll give it 10 more seconds. And yes, if you want to cheat and use Wikipedia, I can't stop you. All right, 3, 2, 1. Sweet, I have some good results in front of me, I like it. Thanks so much everyone for hearing me and participating. Looks like we got 13 respondents, which is awesome. So out of these, the most popular answers that I got were 93% of folks said that scorpions are arachnids. Boom, 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 yes indeed. As well as ticks were the next most, actually a tie between ticks and mites as the next most popular answer, and those are both correct as well. 36% of people said that ticks and mites were also arachnids. And then the imposters in this group, the ones that are just insects or just myriapods, are beetles, centipedes, and aphids. We can get a little bit more to the technicalities of like what makes something an arachnid, but again, it's kind of hard because it's not like there are hard and fast rules where it's like, yeah, generally all arachnids have 8 legs, but there's always an exception somewhere. You know, at some life cycle stage, they only have 6, or some species only have 6 or only have 0 eyes instead of 8 eyes like many of them do. So things are fuzzy, and I know it can be frustrating, but it's also kind of encouraging to see what amazing varieties are out there in the world. Oh, I can share results, cool. So you can kind of see the graph for yourself, hopefully. Yeah, lots of good answers. Thanks again, everyone. Great, so let's start by talking about probably the most popular and the type of arachnids that you all are here to learn most about, because everyone knows we love spiders, and hopefully if you are here, you don't have terrible, sorry. So yeah, we'll start talking about spiders because they're most popular, but there are a lot of other great ones. More than half of the different groups of arachnids that exist in the world exist at Mount Hood, and likely your own backyard as well. So that includes spiders. Opilionids, we'll learn what those are. You've definitely seen them. I'm about 90% sure that you have. Mites and ticks are also really, really prevalent and really important to learn about. Pseudoscorpions are one of my other favorites in addition to jumping spiders. They're just really, really weirdly cute. And I didn't know they existed until 2 years ago. 3 years, you know, a few years ago. The next one that's a really weird name is with a question mark next to it is because I've seen some reports of forest scorpions existing out at Mount Hood, but a lot of it's through like iNaturalist. And so I'm pretty sure they're out there. You know, I trust people's identification skills, but it's also uncertain. So it's exciting that they might be out there. As well as there's probably more because there are a lot of arachnids that are like really, really tiny and live in the dirt. And so they don't get researched as much. So I'm sure they probably exist out at Mount Hood, but I don't have specific info to be showing you all of my certainties. But great, let's move on to spiders. They're really cool. Let's talk about those. All right, so this is another really weird visual. I know I'm throwing some weird things at your screens probably. But one really interesting thing about spiders is that as far as identification goes, of course, getting down to the species level, anyone who's, you know, done plants or like tried to identify a lot of different organisms know that sometimes it's really hard to get that much information to have like 10,000 different species, learning how to identify them. So what a lot of folks do is learn by families. And so if you remember, that's like 2 groups up removed from species to kind of give you like, oh, this is the general group, this is the general group. And when it comes to spiders, families are distinguishable by their eye arrangement, which is pretty cool. And I know a lot of arachnologists personally that take their favorite type of spider and get a tattoo of the eye arrangement. It's a really popular visual that I've seen at multiple conferences. And yeah, a lot of these this is just a handful of the spider families. There's about 114 different families total, representing like those 100,000 species that we mentioned earlier. So yeah, let's go ahead and dive in and talk about a few of these. I can point them out before we move on to the next slides. This is our friends, the jumping spiders again. They're in the family Salticid, and they have really amazing eyes. You can kind of see like the first 2 are really, really enlarged, and they're really developed so that they can capture, you know, not just like changes in light and color, but like a lot of really great depth perception. And they of course can see, you know, all around. The ones in the back that are smaller eyes can kind of just distinguish light and dark, so they can like catch you sneaking up in front of them, but maybe they can't see as well as they can if you're right in front of them. The ones up here are kind of your classic orb weaver spiders called Arachnids. They're the ones that you think of when you think of a spider web. You think of this big, beautiful, flat, kind of octagonal one. This one we'll get to talk a lot more about later. They're called the bird turd spider, and I bet you're wondering why. And the one after that, probably familiar from a lot of your gardens. They come out of Portland this time of year, and so they're called pumpkin spiders because it's almost fall and because they are orange like a pumpkin. But they're also just called the garden spider, the garden orb weaving spider. A lot of different names, of course, common names are abound. Over here, we've got, I'm already forgetting. Oh yeah, Arachnidae, which is kind of a mouthful. But those are the ones that sometimes if you see a spider that's made a web and it's very much like a little funnel, like it's got kind of a sheet coming out and then it goes back into this little hole. Those are the Arachnidae, and they're kind of like generic little brown looking spiders. They're easy to mix up with things like wolf spiders, which have this eye arrangement number 1. So I'm not as good about distinguishing like the small brown spiders, you know, that run around. So I am trying to learn a lot better how to identify beyond just like kind of looking up close at the eyes, because probably a lot of you understand that's not always the most practical way to identify a spider that's either running away from you or that you might be a little bit too spooked to get really up close and personal with. So yeah, we can dive some more into how else to appreciate spiders, how else to learn about them if we're not, you know, looking at them under a microscope and getting a steady look at their eye arrangement necessarily. Oh, and of course, I can't forget, a barker named Kim Hack took this really amazing photo of a crab spider. So crab spiders are also really badass. We'll dedicate a slide to them as well because they have beautiful, beautiful coloration. It's kind of easy to remember they're called crab spiders because they have this very kind of like, you know, open-armed arrangement reminiscent of a crab for sure. And yeah, they hang out a lot along like the roadsides. So if you're hiking or even just driving through Mount Hood, you might see, if you like stop and get up close, you'll probably see a crab spider. And I think they only have 6 eyes, which is a little bit strange too. I might be wrong on that, but they're kind of this like middle arrangement. So already a lot of variety just within the groups of spiders in the world. There we go. All right, talking a little bit more about jumping spiders. Like I said, they're in the family called Salticidae. I could like fill up this entire page with different like colorations, different varieties of spiders. Probably a lot of you are familiar with, there were some viral videos going around the past couple of years of peacock spiders that like lift up their back abdomen like a sheet and then do this weird dance where they like vibrate their arms a lot. They're just so fun to watch. They're adorable. And like I said, they're kind of the charismatic microfauna of the invertebrate world. So they do get kind of a lot of attention from researchers just because they're so cute. And so people tend to research them more, which is a funny bias to have kind of built in. And so yeah, that means we know a lot more about them just because people are more willing to like get up and close personal with them. A lot of them also don't give like really dangerous bites. So you can kind of like play with them on your hands and they'll just jump, 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 jump around. And speaking of those jumping skills, that's one of the things researchers have been really interested in is how this like tiny little organism, you know, almost like a flea, maybe not as quite as powerful as a flea, but is able to like generate such a quick, sudden burst of energy. And a lot of it is from, rather than like a traditional muscle sculpture, you know, muscle structure where it's like, oh, I have these two muscles helping my leg move. Theirs is more of like a pressure system where spiders have this kind of like fluid in their bodies that's almost like blood called hemolymph. And they can like compress or expand air to come in and fill up their legs or like kind of constrict them as well. And so that's what kind of enables them to like snap back and forth really well, if that makes sense. If people have questions, I'm happy to take a pause after I talk about jumpers so that people can ask any questions that they have up until this point, because I know I might be talking kind of fast because I'm nervous. Anyways, talking about jumping skills, that's something researchers have been studying a lot because they've actually been able to train jumping spiders to jump on command. Like they can like put them up onto the edge of a table and then like give a signal. I don't actually know how they do it, whether it's a vibration or a color or sound signal that gets them to jump. And for anyone who's like, you know, done a science project, it's really useful when your like subjects are so easy to kind of like time and everything and set up, rather than just kind of have to be like running around and hoping that you start your timer when you see a spider jump or something like that. So it's kind of interesting. Like I said, there's lots of other cool research in addition to those jumping skills. I have some friends who have studied kind of like the eye structure of spiders, and they've learned that they can really distinguish between things like fluorescent lights, daylights, and they can see the moon, which is like a really poetic kind of funny thing to think about, being like, oh, spiders can like recognize and observe the moon as a distinct light source from others. So yeah, they're just amazing little creatures, and you can kind of tell from that bottom picture, this is a zebra spider. The one with the green chelicerae is called a daring spider. It's one of the most common ones around here. It's called the daring jumping spider. One of the most charismatic parts of them is that you can kind of like visibly see them like turn up and look at you. So it's like they use that really great vision to like zero in on you, and then just like almost like a puppy sometimes they'll like adjust to look at you. So I understand if that totally creeps you out. I find it adorable. I see Lo's giving opinion. I love it. All right, let's see what else we got. Ooh, yay, another favorite coming up. So the bird turd spiders. These you will also definitely see at Mount Hood. Kind of at any time of year. I guess I notice them a little bit out more during the summer and spring, but they're also called trash line spiders because they very literally will use kind of the extra stuff that they don't consume from their prey to build a line in their web. So when they build that kind of traditional, you know, circular-ish web, they'll use the, you know, exoskeletons or legs or wings or whatever else from the insects that they didn't want to eat, and they'll arrange it in a line so that it kind of makes it look like a hanging strand of like bird poop, or just like, you know, stuff, lichen falling off of a tree, for example. So kind of as a disguise both from predators and from prey. And also just the shape of their bodies altogether. I apologize for the watermarks in the image. I know it can be a little funny looking, but they also just like look like a tiny little piece of bird poop. So very, very innovative kind of way of disguising. And yeah, their webs are like, you know, about the size of like, maybe like a small book or something like that. So they're really small overall, but the web is noticeable. And if you're out and you see just a strand of stuff hanging, kind of cool to just yell out, bird turd, I see you. All right, now we can also talk about crab spiders. So crab spiders are unbelievably talented. Two of their biggest talents that are related to each other are their hunting skills, as well as they can change color. So when I first heard that, I was just like, whoa, cool, just like a chameleon. And then I researched, and it takes them between 10 to 25 days to change color. So it's not quite the like instantaneous, like, oh, I scooted onto a different flower. It's more of a kind of strategic, like, oh, it's this flower's in season. I'll hang out mostly on the pink stuff for now because they're blooming first. And then as, you know, the season changes, oh, maybe yellow is a bit more strategic to hang out on like some St. John's wort, which is the most common flower I've seen them on out at Hood, is kind of this more really rich yellow color. And they'll use that to kind of disguise, lie in wait. And when things like insects, especially like bees, come to pollinate the flowers, they are powerful enough to take on a full bumblebee that's like 2 or 3 times their size, which is really impressive. So yeah, you can see those out at Mount Hood, like I said, on the roadside, like when St. John's wort is growing. And so these are spiders that don't build as much of a web. They're more of a hunting spider, so they can still produce silk for a number of purposes, like for wrapping up their eggs, or spiders will always just have a drag line behind them, kind of like a, you know, security system, like when you go climbing, you're always, you know, tied to something solid, hopefully. So that's one of, usually spiders produce at least 6 different kinds of silk, and 8 different kinds of silk if they build webs. So not only are they like these amazing engineers that can build silk, they have it so specialized depending on what purpose they're using it for, that they have separate glands inside of them for these different silk purposes. So much more complex than at first glance. All right, talked a little bit about crab spiders. What else we got? Ooh, so moving away from spiders, although very easy to confuse with spiders, are what are called harvestmen, or Epilionids for a more gender neutral term, because harvest person doesn't really quite work with an arachnid quite as well. So harvestmen are super interesting. Someone has described them to me as kind of like an 8-legged lentil, because as opposed to spiders that have a really distinguished 2 body parts composure, they have more of just a fused body segment. So compared to insects, for example, that have kind of like your head, thorax, and abdomen, spiders usually just have, you know, a cephalothorax, a head fused with a thorax, and then an abdomen. It's all just one piece with harvestmen. So these are things you'll see in your garage, little things you'll see out at a tree at Mount Hood. They're really all over the place. And they're incredible for a couple of reasons. One of the reasons that they're called harvestmen is their eating habits are really strange. They'll eat snails, like if there's one that's not doing so well or a snail that's like gotten turned over, they'll just kind of use their really interesting little front claws, which are called chelicera, to kind of like scoop out the slime and just eat snails like so. Probably a little bit easier when they're in their smaller larval stages, the prey, but they will also go after adult snails and slugs and stuff. Another really interesting thing that harvestmen are getting a lot of attention for is especially in the robotics field, where people are trying to design robots or vehicles that can like adapt to different styles of moving. Like harvestmen, you can imagine that they have these 8 legs, and it's really easy for them to like lose one running away from a predator. So they might only have 6, 5, even 4 legs left, and they're able to adapt how they move. And so they're able to move really smoothly still through the forest floor, even with, I think, as few as 3 legs, they're able to still keep up a pretty healthy pace. And so in like the whole field of biomimicry, where human engineers try and borrow designs from nature, Epilionids are one of the most inspiring ones, that they're just like, ooh, yeah, we could really use this on how to like get things to intelligently relearn how to move if they lose a limb, or if one just short circuits and goes out of commission for a bit, being able to kind of quickly adapt. And these Epilionids that have the little like bunny ears aren't necessarily found out in Mount Hood. Those I think are ones that are found in Asia, but they're just like really irresistibly cute. And I thought it was a good kind of close up to show that yes, like spiders, they do still have 8 legs. They also have these 2 kind of little things in front called pedipalps. So there's a weird distinction between pedipalps are the ones that are a bit more like arms, that aren't quite as long as regular arms, but are short ones. And then the things that the fangs sit on are called chelicera. And chelicera are something that are common to all arachnids. So they'll have those like things that look like mouth appendages, and a lot of them will also have pedipalps, which are the shorter arms. And the shorter arms also double as reproductive appendages, because instead of, like usually fertilization happens when the sperm is retrieved from inside the body using a pedipalp and then transferred to a spider carrying eggs, so that they double as both assistance in eating, but also for reproductive purposes. That's what pedipalps are for. All right.
On the subject of spiders, we have a question from Monica.
Oh, beautiful. Thank you. Yeah, what's up, Monica?
Is there a specific chromosome or gene spiders have to change color? Is it similar to the gene a chameleon has? Not even sure if it is a gene.
Ooh, I need to research that more, because I honestly don't know if it's, yeah, a genetic thing, or if it's more like, because yeah, I think when it comes to chameleons and things like octopi and things like that, they use like chromatophores, which are less a gene and more just like almost independent thinking organs that kind of respond to environmental changes or to hormones or to things like that. But I will write that down and look it up and get back to you, Monica, because that's a really cool question to how they change color, because I want to know too. Yeah, I'll take a breather. I know I've been talking a lot for folks to either shout out or type in the chat any questions that they might have. I'll drink some water. Ticks and mites, this is like a really, really big group of organisms. There are like tens and tens and tens of thousands of these different kinds. And everyone's probably, the front of everyone's mind is just like, oh, ticks, yeah, some of them are dangerous, right? I should probably know which ones are the ones to look out for. Good news is it's, as far as my research shows, there's one kind of tick in Oregon that is most likely to carry Lyme disease, and 3 that tend to go for humans. There are a total of about 20 different tick species in Oregon specifically. But yeah, so it's kind of comforting that the odds are, out of all of those tick species, a little bit less likely to encounter a dangerous one. And again, so it's not necessarily the arachnid itself that's venomous. I think ticks do produce a tiny bit of venom, but not enough to harm humans. And Lyme disease comes from a bacteria that they carry. So the bacteria is the Lyme disease-inducing disease there, and the tick is merely a vector, which probably a lot of you know already, especially if you have dogs, you've been having to be really careful about flea and tick medicine, I'm betting. So yeah, specifically the ones that'll be really dangerous are the western black-legged tick. That's the one most likely to carry Lyme, so it has that kind of very cherry red color on the back. Whereas Pacific coast ticks and American dog ticks have redder legs, so there's a bit of a distinction there. Color isn't always necessarily the best species distinguisher among most arachnids, so always good to keep an eye out since there can be variation in environment, region, temperature, things like that can all impact color perception and everything like that. And then actually a lot more exciting than they sound are mites. So a bit, again, back to taxonomy and how imperfect it is, mites and ticks have a very, very close relationship. So if there's no clear line being like, oh, they're separate orders, oh, they seem pretty closely related, maybe they're just different suborders. But also generally they fall into the different orders of Cariformes and Parasitiformes. And just from the name, you can kind of get the vibe that a lot of mites are, lumped into a parasitic group, which they can be. There's mites living on you and me right now, just all over our bodies. I know that's kind of a creepy thing to think about, but a lot of them kind of help keep just healthy things in check. It's totally a normal, natural thing. And there's a really interesting statistic about like just how many mites exist in soil, and they're a really amazing, important component of making sure that soil gets circulated a lot down on a really small molecular level, like, things like earthworms and all these other cool bugs kind of like really help with the large scale stuff and breaking down things like wood. And then a step below that to make sure that things are like the food chain even keeps going are mites. So they're really, really cool to learn about. Let me see if I can find those stats really quick because they're ridiculous. Here we go. I'll read a little excerpt from a book that's called The Hidden Forest. So as the title implies, it's all about forest ecology, but kind of what's below your feet. So every time you take a step in a mature Oregon forest, your foot is being supported on the back of 16,000 invertebrates, held up by an average of 120,000 legs. So I did a really quick bit of math. And so like they calculated the size of a footprint, like an average person's foot. And 120,000 legs divided by 16,000 invertebrates is an average of 7.5 legs. So that's an average of mostly arachnids, small, big predominance of those guys. There should be a lot more research on mites since there's so many different species of them, and that's known species, goodness knows there's probably more. So they become a really important indicator of, like I said, really down on a small molecular level, what soil composition is like, both like chemically and environmentally, being like how much moisture, what the temperature is like. So especially in the era of climate change, they can be a really important tool in kind of gauging, especially gauging over time, how those mite populations might be varying, how their distributions might be changing as whether things like climate change or even things like pollution. Mites can be a really useful way to kind of judge soil health and soil quality, or rather than like with values like soil quality, just seeing what's there in the first place. So a lot more research on mites would be really, really exciting, which I know you're all super excited to jump into. All right, what else we got? So also living in the dirt alongside a lot of these mites are really, really cute tiny pseudoscorpions. And I always feel bad for an animal where their name is like just a ripoff of another animal's name rather than their own thing, but you can understand why they're called pseudoscorpions. They kind of look like a tiny little scorpion bug, like went to the gym and just like worked out their arms way too much. So they are visible to the naked eye, a lot of them. So even though they are really tiny and tend to live in the soil, you know, eating other smaller mites and being food for like bigger spiders, for example. There is a weird fact that they also can be found in a lot of books, like physically in libraries or in bookstores. They're also known as book scorpions because they feed on the little mites and the little insects that help eat up paper or help decompose leather, like in really old books. So I haven't been lucky enough to come across one in a book yet, but maybe someday if I'm lurking around like some really old collections or something like that, I can come across one. And the one down in the left corner for most of your screen is one of the most popular genuses in around Oregon. It's called Apochthonius, and couldn't get down to the species level because when it comes to identifying pseudoscorpions by species, you have to like really get down and observe like their claws, you know, those pedipalps, for example, and count how many ridges. So like a species that has like 67 ridges will be different from a species that has 66 ridges. And it's just like kind of a nightmare to get down on that, to get that far into the weeds. But yeah, that was one that I found and took a photo of at Lewis and Clark when I was studying some cool invertebrate stuff for undergraduate. So this is literally what we can find in our own backyard if I was able to find it on a, you know, urban college campus. And yeah, really tiny. I forget the exact measurement of that one, but it was between 2 and 8 millimeters. Cool, what else we got? Okay, so beyond pseudoscorpions, there's also maybe actual scorpions. Again, I haven't been able to find a whole lot of really solid information, but scorpions are usually associated with, you know, these kind of drier environments of like, you know, the Southwest and the deserts and everything like that. But there are some forest scorpions on the West Coast that are more adapted to wetter climates. Some of them even like hang out under logs and things like that. So the species that's particular to the Pacific region, Pacific forest scorpion, is called Arachnids mordax. And there was a report last year in the news that some were found like just north of Salem, so fairly close, maybe totally possible that they're out at Mount Hood if they were found so close to like an urban area. Totally possible that they're there too. And I think in my research, I didn't dive in too far, but there's about 3 species of scorpion that are native to Oregon, which I had no idea about. I did not expect them to be living this far north, but apparently, yeah, which is really cool. A couple fun facts about scorpions. I do believe all of them, if not just most of them, glow under UV light. So that's kind of an interesting way to like study their skeletons. Like if you're in a, you know, if you're in a lab and the electricity goes out or something, some people have these little UV flashlights that they can use to like keep observing scorpions. And one of the folks that I've done research with was a biologist named Rich, and he did his like doctoral dissertation studying like how a scorpion uses its lifetime supply of calories. So he had this really funny pie chart being like, oh yeah, 30% go towards hunting and 30% to reproduction and like X number towards like resting. And it's just like kind of a hilarious reminder of like how incredibly specific some people's research can get, really going into the weeds of like, someone just wondered, I wonder how a scorpion, you know, consumes so many calories and how exactly it uses those. So kind of a reminder, there's no such thing as a stupid question in science. Just be curious about something and go for it, and who knows what really interesting answers you can get. All right, so I know scorpions are an especially kind of like dangerous, iffy one, that type of arachnid that people are a little more on the fence about. So I feel like it's probably a good time to talk about like dangers associated with arachnids. Like people might be curious which ones are actually poisonous, which ones really pose a threat. So I'm not a total expert on this, but I can give kind of a quick overview of perceived and actual threats from arachnids. And I can also give especially a breather during this next portion because I know people might have questions come up. So as far as dangers go, I did like some really, really general kind of categories into like some dangers, a bit, and not much. So you can probably tell some of the ones that we've already mentioned are things like ticks, which do carry Lyme disease. So that's especially in the era of climate change where habitats of ticks are expanding. That's really something to do your best to stay vigilant about if you can. Especially if you are able to preserve any tick that you're worried about that you find on your dog or your person, find like a little glass jar, peanut butter jar, you know, something to be able to keep it in so that there can be like a positive identification to double check and hopefully assuage some worries that you have if it's just, you know, one kind of tick that you don't have to worry as much about. Also, definitely in this region, we do have black widow spiders. There's several different species of black widow spiders. The one we have around here is called the western black widow. There's kind of an interesting distinction between like the kind that carry eggs, so usually ascribed female spiders, as well as the males, which are like way smaller and way different looking. The male ones don't carry like a especially dangerous venom to humans. The egg-carrying spiders do have a little bit more of a toxic bite, but it's not as much of like it's not quite as fatal as most people have thought over the years. They're finding that most cases are really treatable, especially if, you know, you go and get some medical attention pretty quickly. So it's comforting to know that it's not a complete death sentence getting attacked by one of these spiders. And again, I know it's not always practical to capture the thing that, you know, just bit you and maybe ran away, but if possible, that's always a good way to kind of get some certainty that of what your risk would be. So as far as some of the ones that fall a bit more in the iffy distinction of how dangerous they are, the one above you probably, it has a horrible name, so I'll probably use its binomial name more, as the hobo spider. This is one that was introduced from Europe, and so people were worried that it was posing a lot more danger when it came here to the United States. Not quite sure how long ago. But recent research is kind of showing that they're not quite as dangerous as had previously thought. A lot of the reported cases were found to be like, you know, other spiders or black widows, for example. So not super scary to find one in your house. If you're able to just like scoot it away or scoop it up and throw it out a window, it's a good way to go. The one that is more common, so the one below that is called the northern yellow sac spider. This one is super common. I probably have pulled like 3 out from my room every week. They do tend to hang out in houses a lot, and it's pretty recognizable probably by the name sac spider. They create like a little like covering, almost like probably the size of this pendant, maybe a little bit smaller. And then they'll like hide in there during the day. So like a little sack that they'll make for themselves. Also just out in nature, they'll do that under leaves or like under sticks and things like that. And they do, this is the most common spider that bites people in Oregon. So whenever you get a spider bite that hurts, that's noticeable, but isn't lethal, that's probably one of these sac spiders. And definitely not lethal, like I said, but enough to be almost as bad as a bee sting is kind of that's like the comparison I found when researching a lot of these venomous spiders, with people saying like, yeah, they're not lethal. The worst you'll have is a sting that's a little bit or almost on par with a bee sting. But I definitely want to acknowledge that people's bodies are different and will react differently. So I can't just say, oh, it's no big deal, because some people really do face a much tougher time than others when they're bitten by spiders. And then not much, you'll probably all have heard a lot about the brown recluse and heard a lot of concern, and probably seen some really gross photos of like giant gaping holes in people's arms or even on people's faces. The good news is they're not established in Oregon. They're pretty easy to confuse with other spiders, so people were really worried that brown recluse's range had expanded up to Oregon. They do exist in the southern United States, but their range doesn't extend much further than Southern California. And as far as like, it's totally possible that like, of course, introduced species are a thing. So like, you know, have people like maybe moved some to Oregon, but they haven't become established. So they haven't, you know, really established populations here, which is pretty comforting, hopefully. And kind of a fun fact that'll sound really spooky at first, but is actually really comforting, is there was one house they found in Kansas, and inside the basement there were 4,000 brown recluses, but no one in that family of 4 living in that house had ever been bitten for like the 10 years that they and the spiders had been coexisting. So kind of spooky that someone would be living with so many spiders. I know even that would make me shiver, but also just like that they had been in that close proximity to one another and not hurt each other. They're called brown recluse for a reason. They're really, really skittish. They really like staying hidden away from people. So the old adage that your maybe parents always said, they're more scared of you than you are of it, definitely applies to 99% of spiders for sure. Okay. So moving on from dangerous spiders to kind of on the flip side, arachnids that people might be concerned about making sure there are enough of. I was really curious, like, because whenever I'm out with Bark and we're doing surveys, we always have in the back of our minds, like, oh, are there any protected species? Because especially if there are endangered species, or even just survey and manage species, which maybe aren't endangered, but still have some legal protections to make sure that they're not, you know, that there isn't a ton of logging happening right in the habitat of, you know, native, endemic, important species. Yeah, there's a lot of like plants on those lists of protected species, but, and I know there's a lot of invertebrates, so I was curious if there are any arachnids. And I'm a little bit frustrated to say I didn't find much, and I think that's partially because they're just not researched quite as much, so we don't know the population, vitality, the population statistics of many of them. So we can't deem, how endangered they are, how healthy they might be. But the one little thing I did find is that there is one protected, or actually two protected species of pseudoscorpions. And this was kind of a wild card because I was expecting like, a spider or some like larger arachnid that's like easy to see and discover, or like see and like keep track of or study a little bit easier. So I was really surprised that pseudoscorpions, which are these really little weird things that are hard to even find in the first place. So the story with this one protected, or I keep saying one, I could only find photos, not even photos, just like a drawn image of one of them. I couldn't find any information on the entire internet, but I could stand to look a bit more about Apochthonius forbesii. So the top one, the one that's named after the Malheur region, is only found in one particular cave in the Malheur region of Oregon. So a little bit south of the Malheur National Forest, I think in a town called Princeton, there's a cave that has just like several easily found pseudoscorpions. So again, going kind of into the weeds of like how under-researched these creatures are, a lot of the information in the file that I think it was at the Forest Service or OSU provided about these species, kind of like, we don't know much, we're just kind of assuming they're similar to these other species. They probably live about 5 years, they probably live in these habitats. And again, they were only able to distinguish this as a separate species based on like how many like little ridges were on the chelicera, for example. So again, really getting in the weeds, how many hairs are sticking out of that claw. All those little details really matter when it comes to a species level. So yeah, I guess this is kind of like an encouragement, like especially if you are a bark volunteer and you are someone who's kind of like looking out for protected species, like to start thinking about invertebrates more, because that can be kind of an exciting thing to find and would be a really cool thing to bring up in a lawsuit, being like, you can't log here because there are these really tiny little buggos hanging around. Or yeah, even if you're not, getting your boots on the ground, still kind of like having this in your mind when you're participating in public comment periods or otherwise trying to influence public policy, to always remember to kind of look out for like the less obvious organisms that still have a really, really important role in our ecosystems. So pseudoscorpions being a really good example of those. All right, so I just wanted to kind of give a shout out to a lot of the arachnids that we maybe won't necessarily see in person out at Mount Hood, but that still exist in the world and still have some cool facts that I'm happy to share about them. And I probably should have warned you before I showed the photos, because especially the amblypygid on the left side is probably one of the scariest organisms I've ever come across. They just look like things out of a nightmare. But anyways, these are 4 other orders of arachnids, so kind of on the same scale as spiders and scorpions. These are whole groups of organisms that exist out there. And probably one of the most fascinating ones is amblypygids, which has a really silly name, I know. I'm happy to share. So I'm addicted to puns, and I told myself I'd only tell one real pun during this whole presentation. But when I did a research trip at a station in Costa Rica, I had a colleague who was studying amblypygids. He was studying how well they are at relocating back to a home tree, because they go out to hunt during the night, and then they have this like home tree as like their home base that they always come back to. So he was trying to see, like, do they do that through like vibration? Do they do it through smell? Or do they use some other chemosensors as a way to navigate and find their way back to this home tree? And so I went back and went out with him one day trying to look for a pool of them to study, because he hadn't found any yet, and he really wanted to find a solid group of them, so we had a data pool to study them from. And when we were out walking around, there's like a whole other lot of cool animals we're finding. So in addition to cool spiders, we're also just noticing a lot of birds. And there are also these really cute little like wild piglets called, I think they're called peccaries. And so we saw a family cross us as we were looking for these amblypygids out in the wild. And a whole family crosses our way. And of course, just like in all the cartoons, there's like big one, medium-sized one, and then like 3 little babies. And there's one that's like really slow, like trying to catch up with the family. And I see this cross our way and I'm like, Tyler, finally, an ambling piglet. He gets really excited because he thinks I've said amblypygid. But I'm sorry, that's the worst pun ever, but that's what I came up with on the cuff, and I was really proud in that moment. He gave me a slow clap and everything. Anyways, amblypygids, they're really fascinating beyond their weird name. Like I mentioned, they do have these really fascinating kind of navigational abilities, because they can be like tens of meters away from a home tree and still find their way. And it's definitely not because of eyesight, because you can kind of like barely see in this photo, those 2 little dots are one set of eyes. They have 3 sets of eyes. One is kind of on the sides of the head. So 2 here and 2 here. So 6 total. And then they can just like, so they're just so weird to explain too. They're such weird creatures. those kind of like folding arms in front of them are the pedipalps. So kind of like we mentioned, they're specialized for reproduction in a lot of cases. I don't think that's the case with amblypygids because they have like really giant weird claws. So I think it's more for like predatory purposes to like bring prey in towards their mouth. And they do have 8 legs technically, although you can kind of see that beyond the first set of legs, the second set of legs right behind kind of, you know, where you want the shoulders to be. The legs have evolved into more just like sensors that kind of like wave around like little hairs, so they can kind of detect where they're going. Are they about to hit a rock? Is there a bird flying overhead? They can kind of sense that through these really fine hair-like legs that they've adapted into sensors. And then on each of those legs is a whole lot of different hairs and small like pores, and those work as chemosensors. So that kind of like a smell, they can like sense like what the chemical changes are, or if there's another organism nearby. Is it a friendly one? Is it one of their own, or is it something that's trying to eat them? I don't know what would try to eat these animals, but I think a lot of like rodents especially go after them. Anyways, I've been talking about amblypygids a lot, but they are closely related to another group of arachnids called Thelaphonids. So Thelaphonidae is the formal name, and they're also known as vinegaroons. And they get that name because they can literally shoot a compound very similar to vinegar out of their tail as a defense mechanism. So they like spray it into like the face of a rodent to irritate them. Very, very weird adaptation, but very fascinating that arachnids have just an endless creativity with how they've evolved. And then the 2 orders that are on the right side of the screen called rhizomelids and schismodids. Those are more, again, the really small scale kind of dirt dwelling arachnids that kind of help the soil ecosystems run smoothly. They keep populations in check, serving as like largely predatory. But a lot of arachnids, when people ask, oh, what do they eat? They eat other arachnids is kind of a really common answer. So yeah, a lot of good soil health happening in those. I know the Schismodida looks like a pretty large organism, but they're also just a couple of millimeters maximum usually. So they're kind of more soil dwelling little ones as well. And okay, so the next slide is also kind of a continuation of stuff you might not necessarily see at Mount Hood, but more specific back to spiders. There's so much other cool spider stuff happening in the world. So just kind of a quick grab bag of cool images of spiders. The mimics that you see on the left side, so back to jumping spiders, salticids, they're extraordinarily adaptable, and one of their main talents is mimicking other animals. So there's so many good mimics of ants. So the one at the bottom is kind of a good example. You can see that there's kind of that crown of 8 eyes going around the top, and they've kind of like evolved their pedipalps to look more like kind of an ant's antenna, which is really pretty convincing, and especially with the coloring. They're able to just kind of like slip into line of ants and just pick them off one by one because they're, you know, a similar size, but very, very strong. The one above it is more of like a scorpion mimic of a spider, which is a hilarious thought to think of a really small spider mimicking a scorpion, but I think it pulls it off pretty well. And then the ones on the right side are other kinds of spiders. One is the mirror spider, which is able, it has these little, I don't know actually what material they're made of. It's like a protein or just some kind of part of their exoskeleton that they can either expand out to more of like a funny disco ball vibe, or just like contract down to be more of like a solid mirror, which is really fascinating. I think it's partially to like create a literal mirror shining effect to confuse predators at some point, or maybe stun prey. I should research that a little bit more because I'm not sure why they evolved it. I'm not sure if researchers know why they evolved that, but really, really gorgeous. This is the kind of stuff you find on Pinterest when you look up pretty spiders. You find weird mirror spiders and things like that. And I also just have to give a shout out to down in that corner, down on the lower left. Sorry, I have trouble telling my left and right for some reason. So that there was a story going around a couple years ago that that the oldest known spider in the world had passed away. So this is a trapdoor spider in Australia that was confirmed to be at least 40 years old. So there was like this one researcher woman in Australia who had been out researching trapdoor spiders, and kind of like for shits and giggles a couple years later, or even decades later, she went out, she's like, oh, I wonder if that same spider that was always my like reliable go-to, the one data point that I could always rely on, is still there. And she was a number of times, but then after a while she realized that the hole had been vacated and that her sweet spider friend that she'd researched for so many years had passed away. But still amazing that, you know, an arachnid who's like, you know, not very large can live to be 40 years old. It's pretty cool. So yeah, I know I'm kind of on this kick of just like showing you cool stuff without much context, but this next one hopefully wraps up some interesting things about spiders, and especially in the era of silk, which is like one of the like really main innovations that spiders have created over the years. This was the bulk of one of my research projects, was taking these photos, and it's really, really cool to just see them like without any context, because I just think they're really, really beautiful as is. And then you kind of learn more being like, what's going on here? And what you can kind of see if you look a little bit closer is, I had mentioned that spiders that build webs have up to 8 different kinds of silk that they use, and corresponding glands as well, because there's a slightly different, chemical mixture in them, so they have to put in different compounds to those glands to make sure they get the right kind of silk. And that'll depend a lot on what the spider is doing. So the ones that will build webs will look different from ones that don't build webs. So for example, this is kind of one of those, I wish I had brought up a photo of it. Scytotidaes are kind of like ground dwelling spiders that do a lot of like running and hunting. And so they, rely a lot less on like, building webs, to rest in or something, but they do have those smaller glands kind of towards the spinnerets, or the little spots that it shoots out of. So it looks like a lot more simple and basic compared to, these huge, long, elaborate ones that look like torn up bridal veils or something like that. And the one in the middle, you'll probably actually, you would see these in your own home if you, took a microscope to a spider in your home, but Fulcidae are the daddy long legs, basically. So they're the ones that look like Apileonids, but are like the spider version of Apileonids. And they kind of look like these hot air balloons. And because they build these really like kind of large, messy cobwebs, kind of your classic cobweb that you find in a house, they like, when they're preparing to build a web, they have to make sure that they have a really large reserve of silk ready to go. So it kind of like has that more balloony effect because they build up some silk so they can build an entire web at once. Tenidaes, the ones down here are kind of the more like scary, almost a tarantula kind of looking spider. Nephilidae are some really beautiful orb weavers as well. They build really elaborate webs. And I'll try and show you a picture of them later, but they have like fuzzy knees for some reason, like very thin, elegant legs, but then like this little tuft of comb-like appendage at their knees. So silk is something that also human researchers are especially interested in because it's such a fascinating, strong, flexible compound that you've probably seen the statistic that it's like stronger than steel, like, amount for amount, if you were able to scale up to the size of a steel beam. Spider silk would be even harder to break, really. But then it also does have that quality of like being easy to break and really flexible and everything like that. So researchers are trying to, one of two things, and both of them are a little weird. One is trying to farm spiders so that they can like, grow silk or like have a steady stream of silk for commercial purposes. Or also people are trying to come up with synthetic silk. So silk itself is a really simple compound of, I think, different amounts of hydrogen and, water, basically, like carbon and water and all that kind of stuff. But getting like the really precise right amounts and right ratios so it has the right texture is really hard to do. So it is, I think they have successfully built like silk garments, like they've made a t-shirt or something out of spider silk, but it's really hard for them to be scaling up to commercial scale. For better or worse, I don't know how I feel about synthetic or farmed spider silk, but it's definitely a front that's relevant in the human economy, so to speak. All right. So yeah, we've explored a lot of really cool ways of like why spiders are so interested, or not spiders, arachnids, Julie, gosh, even I'm slipping up and generalizing into just spiders. Yeah, so we've covered a number of different areas and just kind of wanted to say that these are bubbles that continue to be filled in, like both through your own curiosity and research, and also just people around the world are really curious about arachnids and learning more about what they do. So those fields cover everything from aesthetics, just kind of like this initial taken aback, beauty or fear or however you feel about just seeing spiders, to the technology of like, using biomimicry to either mimic the way an Apileonid can adapt with losing its legs, or spider silk can be used for other purposes, to their roles in ecology, which is largely this, helping cycle soil nutrients and soil ecosystems to keep those in check. Also, a lot of just great services as pest control, making sure things stay in good balance and that we're not overrun by like insects, for example. Arachnids are really, really helpful with that. Culture, definitely across the world, people have been really fascinated with arachnids. There's a lot of symbolism too that has been drawn from spiders, especially being used as symbols of weaving, connections, storytelling. A lot of those are really, really important. Powerful ways that people tell stories is using, animals or the structures that animals create. So a big part of culture, as well as public health. We kind of discussed how they sometimes pose like, dangers to humans, but for every, like venom or for every compound that's dangerous to humans, there's also an asset as well, because you probably know the adage goes that like the antidote to a venom is usually made with that same venom. So venoms are really powerful in that they're like very, very focused on getting to like your nervous system or deconstructing your like muscle cells to really take down a potential prey. And so that's a useful structure for people to use in medicine, being like, oh yeah, we do need a compound that is really good at targeting these specific parts of the body or these specific systems, but to just like adjust it so that it carries a vaccine, for example, instead of carrying, you know, a lethal dose of venom to your system or something like that. So a whole lot of really interesting public health fronts when it comes to studying arachnids, especially from like a biomedical perspective, but also just like public health of like making sure people don't get bit, or when they do that, there's things we can do to keep a better relationship between arachnids and humans and not just try and kill each other too much. All right, so that's a lot of what I've got for today. The next slide is a lot of kind of more further reading / watching, because I know sometimes when I'm recommended a pile of books, I can't make it through that pile of books necessarily. So I tried to also include a few videos, and the variety of videos here kind of includes, one is a really great story that I heard a couple of weeks ago from a Cree elder named Wilfred Buck, who talks about, he studies a lot of astronomy and like constellations and stuff. And so there's a really fascinating story about how grandmother spider, maybe some folks are familiar with the story of Sky Woman falling to the earth. I think it's an Anishinaabe Cree story, but many versions across many tribes. And one version of the story is that she was dropped down to earth using a string of grandmother spider silk. So there's this kind of like really, really closely interwoven relationships between human and animals shared. So that's really, really cool thing to check out. As far as just more kind of like on the goofy side, there's a series on YouTube called True Facts About the Blank. And maybe some of you like animal enthusiasts have seen this. They take like different animals and the narrator just talks in a really silly voice and makes really strange metaphors, but is telling you true facts about this animal. So there are ones about ogre-faced spiders and bolus spiders. Ogre-faced spiders are like, have the eyes of like jumping spiders, except to an extreme. Like they look like they just have two giant telescopes on their face. And it makes them look ugly, which I disagree with, but that's why they got the name ogre-faced, is from that really ridiculous proportion they have. And then if you have kiddos in your life, there's a really cute series called Lucas the Spider. I know it was going viral a little while ago, but it's a small animated jumping spider who's very fuzzy looking. And I think the voice is like the animator's like nephew named Lucas. And it's just like an animated version of him telling stories about like, oh, I lost my ball. Or like, I think it was just made as like a pet project and then it took off on the internet. So some cute stuff there. And then really quickly kind of going through what these other sources mean. The books I reference, one is John Luoma's The Hidden Forest, which is the one that kind of takes this more, like lots of facts for sure, but it's a more poetic kind of like nature writing style book that talks about like all the amazing stuff that's going on in the soil under our feet. But if you're looking for a bit more of like a technical, really in-depth overview of spiders specifically, this like is basically a textbook and a reference book, but it's extremely readable. Like I read it before knowing like anything about spiders and it guided you through and it provided a lot of like really interesting fun facts along the way. So I'd recommend Biology of Spiders. It's got a really simple name too. And then for IDing, so if you're really curious to get to know more about the specific spiders that you come across in your garden, your park, your house out at Mount Hood, I personally haven't used iNaturalist a whole lot, but I know it's a really, from seeing friends use it, I know it's a really useful tool to get kind of community sourced answers on like helping you identify all the different things you come across. One that's a lot more old school version of that is called bugguide.net that I've used over the years. And especially if you're into the very basic HTML early 2000s aesthetic, I highly recommend bugguide.net. It's very, you know, the layout isn't gorgeous, but it's got a lot of really great info on it, very picture heavy and image heavy. So you can type in things like, you know, black spider Oregon, and it like will be pretty helpful about helping you, you know, use pictures to reference what you saw. And a lot of like older, more experienced arachnologists hang out on that site and just have fun. Or also insects, it's not just arachnids, but also just like any invertebrates are fair game on bugguide.net. USA Spiders is kind of just an easy guide of like, click on your state and it'll show you a list of the most common ones there. So again, if you're just kind of trying to identify, oh, I saw one that kind of looked like this, or just curious going forward, which one should I keep an eye out for? USA Spiders is pretty useful. And then as far as like really more like if you're trying to get into the nuts and bolts of, like we said, finding the survey and managed species or finding out more about specific protected spiders, the US Forest Service and Oregon State University both keep really up-to-date information from their latest research about what's out there. So yeah, I think that's about it as far as like all the stuff I have. So now I'm extra excited to hear from folks about what you're still curious about or questions you have or just thoughts you want to share. I'm really, really excited to hear.
There's a couple of questions that already came through the chat.
Awesome.
So from Alessandro, why is there so little research done into the protection of invertebrates, and how do you incentivize people to study them further?
Ah, that's such a good question. That's one I ask myself all the time too. So yeah, I apologize if I don't have a great answer because I'm still figuring it out too. I'm sure, like, as you probably expect, a lot of it just comes from like an innate fear, being like, there's a snowball of like, oh, I don't know much about it, so I'm not going to look more into it, and that kind of feeds into each other. So people just don't, you know, find as much reason to invest either financially or their time or, you know, their extra classes that they have to take when they're going through college or whatever aren't necessarily spent studying invertebrates. But I think a lot of it also just in the like larger environmental movement, we've been really attracted to kind of these like easier to see organisms, you know, like polar bears kind of being the poster child for like the impacts of global warming. And of course they're important creatures, but that can kind of like, people's focus can stay a lot more on the larger charismatic megafauna, so to speak, rather than looking at the little things. I guess the last part of that answer is just like being so small, it's really easy to overlook them, but I think invertebrates have been getting a lot more attention lately. I know people were referencing a lot. There was a New York Times article a couple of years ago being like, oh, the decline of the insect population. And that kind of reminded people how it's like, oh, when your base of the food chain is kind of in trouble, then it has a domino effect going up. So yeah, I guess to answer your question, Alessandro, it's, those are some of the reasons why they might not be getting much more attention, but I think we can like incentivize and motivate people to learn more. Partially through what I really like to do is just showing those really pretty pictures of like kind of the ridiculous variety and like weirdness that a lot of arachnids have, because sometimes if people are even scared by some of them will really draw them in and fascinate them a lot more. And they'll be curious about like, oh, why does it have that anatomy? Oh, why does it live in that environment? And that can snowball in a better way. So hopefully I somewhat answered that question, but I know that there's a lot more to that idea that you brought up.
Next question from Nat is a two-part. They want to know the name of the vinegar eating spider.
Yeah. So the, whoops, I'm way past it. So the vinegaroon, so it's spelled like the word vinegar with O-O-N. It sounds like the name of a pirate ship or something, but vinegaroon is the name of that creature. And if you want to get really geeky and get into its, you know, formal name, it's Thelaphonids. And they're really closely related to amblypygids.
And the second part, are the silk glands always on the same part of a spider?
As far as I know, yes. And I realize I didn't, usually a lot of presentations will have the generic like anatomy kind of diagram. I realized I didn't include it, which is kind of silly. So when I gave this diagram of, actually let's start on like an actual spider. So like down at the butt, basically what you would perceive at the butt, you can usually see two little spinnerets. Especially if you've ever like seen a tarantula in a cage, you've noticed those like two little tails coming out at the end. So those are the two spinnerets out of which the silk comes, and each one has 3 different ducts. So kind of like little tiny spouts that are like really imperceptible to the human eye, basically. And yeah, as far as I know, they're not on other parts of the spiders. They're always on that tip of the abdomen, the posterior tip of the abdomen. And on some of these, the spinnerets are left. So like, for example, on the lower left corner, this Tangelidae has those 2 little brown tabs, so those 2 are the spinnerets. And then from those, on the interior of the spider, are all the silk glands.
Well, I hope so. Feel free to unmute if not. Next one is from Lo. What is the complex strand made out of on the bird turd spiders?
Ooh, what is the strand made out of on the bird turd spiders? So I'm guessing what you're asking. Oh yeah, so you're asking like the composition of what makes up the trash. So it's mostly stuff from the prey from what I remember, but it can also definitely be just things from trees. It can be like little bits of leaves or like a shred of a pine cone, lichen, for example. So yeah, even though most of it comes from previous prey, things like wings or just extra legs or just the harder parts of the exoskeleton that it's not as excited to eat, because a lot of spiders usually use their fangs to, you know, inject inside the organism and scoop out the goopy parts and slurp up all the more liquidy parts of a prey, and they'll use the harder parts to build that kind of strand of bird turd.
We've got another question from Nat, referencing the pedipalps as sperm sharing. Are there spiders that produce both eggs and sperm?
I know like inevitably there must be, just because like whenever you're researching organisms in science, you don't have these like two super neat categories. There are, you know, just a lot of variety in like what spiders are evolving to have. The way I was taught, and again, I was taught in like a Western science institution, it very much taught male and female. So I haven't gotten to do a lot of research yet as far as to see what the nuances there are, and whether there are spiders that can like, you know, self-fertilize. I do know that there is a lot of nuance and distinction in the stage of reproduction where a spider carrying eggs also has a really large chamber in which they can store multiple sperm packets. So they can go around and like, quote unquote, mate with like a dozen different spiders in a night, and then later on choose which one they liked the most. And they've like corresponded in their brain, oh yeah, I'll use this packet because I liked that spider the most. So there's some really fascinating like, and I know it's kind of crude, but like that's what gets a lot of researchers excited, is like learning about the weird sex lives of spiders or whatever organism they're studying. And especially when you have such a huge proliferation of species, a lot of those distinctions on a species level are difference in genital size and type. And so those are the things that evolve fastest in invertebrate species. And so that kind of like causes there to be a lot of like really prolific speciation. So I know that there are like other like interesting, you know, breakups of the otherwise strict binary of eggs and sperm, but that's something I'm excited to look into a lot more. So thanks for asking about it. I want to learn too.
I guess this isn't a question. I just wanted to thank you, and like that pun was really hilarious.
Oh gosh, I'm glad you thought so. I was worried it would just be like, yeah, I'm definitely happy to leave a couple more moments for questions. And then as far as like wrap up goes, we can either have folks head out a little bit earlier, or the video that I had mentioned about Wilford, I already forgot his name, but the Cree elder who's telling the story about Grandmother Spider, the video is about like 5 or 6 minutes. So if people want to watch it together, I'm more than happy to stream it for folks to watch together. But I'll also leave like 10 more seconds for people to ask any questions that they still have.
Question from Emil. What is your least favorite spider?
Oh gosh, actually, well, kind of my favorite, least favorite. Whenever I've been like out with people who know a ton about spiders and I see like a really, really, really tiny cute one, like it's kind of, there's kind of this joke that like the junk drawer of tiny spiders is called Linyphiids. Like that's a family of like really, really tiny spiders. And so when I was a little kid sitting in parks, like I would always just get these really like almost microscopic, like ant-sized black spiders, you know, crawling on me or something. I'd be so curious to learn, what are they? Like I want to learn more about them. They're ubiquitous. But when I went to like, literally, I was studying with one of the world's like leading experts on Linyphiids. He would just look at me like, I don't know. Because it takes a like hyper powered microscope to be able to distinguish. So I guess my least favorite is, I love them and want to learn more about them, but I get so frustrated not being able to learn more specifics about these different species because I can't even like start to learn what they are, I guess, if that makes sense. All right, yeah, I'm happy to, yeah, since we're still got a little bit of time before the technical end time of 7:30. Yeah, Danielle, is it cool if I stream the video from Wilford Buck?
We have one more quick question from Lo. Did you say crab spiders are questionably spiders?
Did I say crab spiders are questionably spiders? I don't think so. Crab spiders are pretty solidly spiders as far as I remember. I'm trying to remember where in the presentation I might have said, you know, something is maybe this, maybe that. Oh!
You said at the very beginning,
yes.
You said something because of the pedipalps. I think it was because of the pedipalps or some kind of
horseshoe crabs.
Oh, horseshoe crabs.
So
okay,
it does
thanks.
have the word crab in it, so good memory, Lou, because I know I like flew by that. So yeah, I remember that being a really interesting thing because you know, we have a tendency to separate like land and sea creatures taxonomically, even if that's not what their genetics say, for example. So there are some branches of arachnids that can include like horseshoe crabs, as well as these things called pycnogonids, which are just really strange sea creatures. Here, I'll kind of just show you on like Google Images really quick. People can still see my screen, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah, sweet. Let's expand this a little bit. So yeah, they just kind of look like they don't have a head or a face. Like they just kind of are this string of legs that meet together with kind of like a vague, you know, gut mouth combination. So yeah, good memory, Lou, of like they're kind of arachnids. They probably belong to a similar like super class or like subclass. But this thing is, you know, these systems are really fuzzy in how to designate what's part of what group. So that, hopefully that answers your question, but feel free to follow up if you're still curious.
I think that's all the questions in the chat, Julie, if you want to stream your video.
Yeah, great. Yeah, I think this would be a really cool note to end on if people are down. And let me know if the sound is misbehaving or anything, and I can also just submit this link to the chat so that people can watch it later. But let's try.
So that's grandmother spider, and she was in charge of the doorways. She was in charge of those portals in the sky, wormholes. She was the one that filtered out, and that's where we get the dream catcher from. Google Managa's grandmother spider. She sits right on the Milky Way. It's still light out, but the Milky Way runs right across, all the way across from west to east, east to west. Right below the grandmother spider in the horizon is still not coming up is the Pleiades, the seven sisters. And that's called Pseudoscorpions, the hole in the sky. And the hole in the sky, as they say, is where we come from. We come from that place. So that hole in the sky, Pseudoscorpions, is where we originate from. And that there is that hole in the sky. When they say hole in the sky, they're referring to a spatial anomaly, a wormhole. They're referring to an alternate reality. And one of the things our people believe is there are alternate realities out there. We're only one of many here in this reality right here, right now, at this time, at this place. And we, as human beings, are just visitors at this place in the short space of time that we have here. And we originally come from up there, up from the sky world. And those beings of light roam the cosmos. And those beings of light look for new experiences, new things to see, new things to do. And say they travel the cosmos and they look for these things. And one of them, in particular, her name was Ecology, Star Woman. That's what we recognize her as, Star Woman. And she was roaming the cosmos and she came across that hole in the sky. And she looked through that hole in the sky and she saw Earth. And she said, she decided she wanted to come and see this place. And so she tried to come through that hole in the sky, but she couldn't do it. She realized she needed assistance. And she realized that another of her kind called Google Managasis sat on that Milky Way and was in charge of those doorways. And so Ecology Club approached Google Managasis and asked for assistance to come through that hole in the sky to visit this place, this Earth here. And so Google Managasis told her, there's 3 conditions you got to meet in order for you to go through that hole in the sky. And one condition was that you had to take a physical form when you came to that hole in the sky, to this place. Other condition was you had to bring a gift when she came to that hole in the sky to remind her of where she came from. And the last condition was that she couldn't stay long when she came to that hole in the sky, to this place. So Ecology Club, Star Woman, she agreed to that. And so Google Managasis, she sent a single strand of webbing to that hole in the sky and lowered Star Woman down to Earth. And Star Woman was the first human being, because when she came through that hole in the sky and she touched Earth, she took a physical form. And that physical form was us, human beings. And she was the first one here. And the gift that she brought us when she came here was the star blanket. The original star blanket had 7 points. And those 7 points were representative of all of the 7 stars you see in the Pleiades. And so the original star blanket had 7 points on it, and it was painted on buffalo hides, all kinds of hides, to remind everybody of where they come from. Because after Star Woman came, then everybody started coming. In regard to staying long, how long is long for a being of energy? So she stayed a lifetime, and then she left. And then others came behind her and followed her. And then eventually there was a lot of people here, a lot of human beings here. And one of the things that they wanted to do was they wanted to honor Achagas squirrel star woman. And so they added an extra point to that 7-pointed star. So nowadays our star blankets have 8 points. And that's because that one extra point is to honor Achagas squirrel star woman. Gugu Minau, my people call her, the first grandmother. And she was the first one here. And through her, we all come here. That single strand of webbing that Gugu Managasi sent down through that hole in the sky to lower Star Woman down, that's the umbilical cord. That's how we all get here. And that's what we have in common. We are all spirit. And we come here and we learn how to be human. And once we learn how to be human, we continue our journey and go somewhere else in these vast cosmos. But space is unending. The elders say that Creator created everything. Creator had a thought and everything came into being. Creator can never end. Creator can never stop. So that means that Creator's thought processes are still happening right now, right at this very second. And that means creation is still expanding. And that means space is never ending. So we have, as human beings, we have no idea how big what you're looking at up there is. No idea whatsoever. We like to think that we're pretty smart and we think, oh yeah, we know what's up there. But we have no idea. We can just see how far the eye can see. And we can imagine some of that. But that space up there is awesome. Almost is never ending. It's continuing and continuing.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Julie.
Yeah, thanks everyone for watching it with me. Yeah, I think it was a good way to kind of reiterate just how important and beautiful things like observation and telling stories are very much a part of research and living in this world alongside all these other organisms, as you know, any science book can possibly even start to tell you. But yeah, if other people want to share thoughts or have further questions, definitely down to turn this more into a bit of a discussion in the remaining few minutes for sure.
All right, well that wraps up tonight's Ecology Club. I'll put our website in the chat just for anyone who hasn't had a chance to check it out yet. You can find upcoming Ecology Club events on the events tab of the website, and also give us a follow on Instagram at barkformounthood, or you can find us on Facebook too. So thank you everyone for attending.